Europe descends into a massive bun fight over the worsening vaccine crisis. Joe Biden looks to spend eye-wateringly large amounts of money on COVID relief and even more eye-watering amounts on climate change. But Greta Thunberg says it's still not enough. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Bad temper between the UK and the EU hit a height this week when the European Council President Charles Michel defended the EU's banning of the export of vaccines to Australia, saying that both the UK and the US imposed a complete ban on vaccine exports, while the EU meanwhile had exported large quantities. This provoked an immediate angry backlash from the UK, which pointed out that the government hadn't banned the export of a single dose of vaccine. Which didn't faze Michel, who said there are different ways to impose a ban, and then asked how many doses did they export. What this does is to equate a contract relationship the UK has with one vaccine supplier, AstraZeneca, with a national ban. That, of course, is not the case. It arises, no doubt, from the fact that the EU has received criticism for seizing vaccines that were intended for Australia, while it feels that it's still in a world of pain because of slow vaccination rates, even while it has been exporting large quantities of vaccines manufactured on the continent, not just to the UK, but to many different destinations. Which is what happens if you have a global marketplace and numerous different countries order vaccines more effectively than you yourself did. But any politicians in that situation are naturally going to seek to deflect blame. And right now, the UK is the scapegoat of choice. Because while the UK continues to vaccinate an ever-growing percentage of its population, a number of EU countries are seeing a third wave of the pandemic emerging. In Italy, infections have risen by 50% in a fortnight and are now at 300 deaths per day. In Hungary, infections have more than doubled in 14 days. Italy's Repubblica newspaper said this: "Fear has turned into anger and exhaustion. We're waiting for the vaccines like pioneers in a Western movie, surrounded by Indians, scanning the horizon and waiting for the 7th Cavalry." The puzzling thing is why the vaccination rates remain as bad as they have been. Because it's not just supply. Germany and France have each used less than 3/4 of their vaccine stocks, while Belgium has used less than a third. Now, it's partly down to the own goal some leaders scored by casting doubts on the AstraZeneca vaccine, which predictably led to public reluctance to take it. But it doesn't seem to be the only issue. Yes, Germany has used less than half its stocks of AstraZeneca vaccine, but it's also used only a third of its supply of the Moderna one. This week, French GPs were banned from putting in fresh orders for AstraZeneca vaccines in a move that Politico described as punishment for not vaccinating fast enough. France has close to 900,000 unused doses of the jab, according to figures from the French Health Ministry. Doctors have accused officials of inflating the numbers to hide their own shortcomings. Well, look, whoever's right, something is seriously wrong. The Telegraph suggested that the rollout appears to have been hampered as much by bureaucracy and incompetence as any controversy over AstraZeneca. And that may be true. I mean, I would be wary of taking that as the story without more information, especially from a British newspaper, given the nature of the current dispute between the two. But there's certainly some issues with the continent that are not happening elsewhere. So, for instance, while the UK, the US, Israel and various others are busy vaccinating away, Denmark has paused vaccination with the AstraZeneca vaccine, saying that there have been reports of cases of blood clots, and other countries, European countries, have then followed their lead. Now, this could be an example of the EU's precautionary approach in action. If so, it's a good reason why it's rarely a good idea. The AstraZeneca vaccine has now been given to many millions of people, and there have been no reports elsewhere of any such problem. The EU regulator, the European Medicines Agency, said this: "There is currently no indication that vaccination has caused these conditions, which are not listed as side effects of this vaccine." I mentioned months ago that one of the problems with a mass vaccination is that somebody will die of something soon after getting it, and people will then start claiming that there was a causation. You wouldn't expect that from the government, however. Professor Stephen Evans, Professor of Pharmacoepidemiology in London, said this: Since we know with great certainty that the vaccine prevents COVID-19 with its attendant disease, and we're almost totally uncertain that the vaccine can have caused this problem, the risk and benefit balance is still very much in favour of the vaccine in my view. But you'd have to figure that the publicity from this recent issue will now double at least the number of Europeans refusing the AstraZeneca jab, which is simply going to make their problems worse. It's fed the appetite in some European countries for stepping around the EU to get vaccines independently. Italy, which really has been suffering from the recent waves of COVID, has reached an agreement with Russia that its Sputnik 5 vaccine will be manufactured in Italy. Officials at the EU are apparently fuming at the move, saying that Sputnik 5 hasn't even been approved yet for use in the EU, and telling states that they must not issue emergency authorization for it. That has then gotten the EU into an angry exchange with Moscow. The developers of a vaccine tweeted this: "We demand a public apology from EMA's Krista Withermer-Hochem for her negative comments on EU states directly approving Sputnik 5. Her comments raise serious questions about possible political interference in the ongoing EMA review." Politics getting in the way of vaccinations in the EU? How dare you! Meanwhile, Hungary, Czechia and Slovakia, all of them badly hit right now, have effectively said screw you and are going ahead with putting Sputnik 5 into the arms of their citizens. The European Medicines Agency did, however, approve Johnson & Johnson's single-shot vaccine this week, giving one more potential source, and one that may be less politically conflicted over than the Russian-associated Sputnik and the British-associated Oxford AstraZeneca. Approval for this one certainly seems to have gone through the system significantly faster than Sputnik, a fact that I expect hasn't gone unnoticed. At some point in the future, surely someone is going to write a book about all of this, what happened behind the scenes. Certainly one that I, for one, would be interested to read. Now, in a minute, we'll look at some of the rest of the week's news, but first, 2 years ago, people were muttering quietly about the prospect of a pandemic, and they were, largely being ignored. That's how issues can come upon you sometimes. Now, arguably, we're doing that to the next genuine real-world problem that we can see bearing down on us if we bother to raise our eyes. People are talking about it, people are referencing it, but largely we're ignoring it. Is it a real looming crisis, or is it just one of those things that people get all hot and bothered about that never come to anything? The issue is growing antibiotic resistance. Many of the routine surgeries we take for granted today, the occasional ailments that can easily be treated, depend on antibiotics. The challenge is that we've been massively overusing them, both in medicine and in animal farming, and a number of bugs are becoming resistant as a result. We haven't discovered new antibiotics for decades, and once the ones we have stopped working, we are suddenly thrown back to an older era, when any invasive surgery could become a route for a fatal infection, when diseases we thought we'd cured once again become incurable. How worried should we be? What's the hype? What's the reality? And is there anything we could, actually do about it? I'll be talking about that next week in the video going live at 7 p.m. UK time on Monday. See you then. This week, President Biden signed off on a massive $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief bill that's largely supported by the American population, because it turns out when you give people some money, they quite like it. But it has many people looking anxiously at what might turn out to be the consequences. Even some of the prominent Democratic economists, such as Larry Summers, fear that this stimulus is too big, that coming as it does, as America's already starting to recover, what it will do is to fuel inflation. Why would that be a big deal? Well, here's why the UK is looking very nervously at the US and taking policy steps to try and insulate it from those consequences. Like everyone else, the UK government has just borrowed stonkingly huge amounts of money to keep the country barely alive through the pandemic. It did so at a time when interest rates had been negligible for a long time, and that made it relatively painless to load up with huge debt. But if, as the economy begins moving again, lots of people start spending their money, And they do so while the corporate sector is still below capacity, and then the US stimulus massively fuels it all. Then inflation results. Now, nothing destroys your economy and your country like runaway inflation. It's something we've had under control for decades, and for good reason. You control inflation with interest rates, and it's a slow, blunt tool. But loaded down with debt as we are, we will be in a whole world of pain if interest rates rise even a little bit. The thing about the Biden coronavirus relief bill is that much of the spending is neither about coronavirus nor relief. There's definitely a problem to be addressed. There's an estimated $420 billion hole in the economy. Arguably, it shouldn't take $1.9 trillion to fill it. Critics have said that the bill is full of opportunistic spending on democratic priorities and constituencies. $130 billion on K-12 education, even though tens of billions of education funding from previous COVID bills are still unspent. Lots of the education spending will take place in 2026 rather than this year. $350 billion in aid to the states and localities, even though according to Moody's economist Mark Zandi, the state and local funding gap is around just $60 billion. So California is expected to have a budget surplus of more than $20 billion this year, but will nevertheless receive more than that much again from the COVID relief bill. And it doesn't stop there. Last week, Democrats introduced their wide-ranging climate change bill with a target of decarbonising the electric grid, the cost of which is estimated between $2 and $4 trillion. It would require 80% clean electricity by 2030 and 100% by 2035. Power could come from sources including wind, solar, but also nuclear. Given the balance of the parties in the Senate, some have suggested the bill should be put through as a budget reconciliation measure, which would enable it to pass on a simple majority rather than requiring a 60% vote. However, moderate Democrat Joe Manchin has said that he would block the bill if put forward on that basis, saying that it has to be able to persuade at least 10 GOP senators to support it. Manchin added his voice to those concerned about the overall debt burden the country's taking on, saying he's concerned that we're just setting ourselves up for a tremendous deep recession that could lead into a depression. And this is the challenge. Regular viewers will know that I support action on climate change, and that goes as far as decarbonising the economy on a 2050 timetable. And yes, that will carry a cost. In the UK, the Committee on Climate Change has looked at all of the practical things that need to be done to reach the end goal, and to some degree at least to cost those. It's not a perfect process, it's entirely open to scrutiny and criticism, but it seems to me the American way of coming up with monster bills stuffed with all sorts of weirdly unrelated spending is not one that's going to get the job done, or indeed to command any kind of trust in the process. Case in point, 12 states have filed suit against the administration over a climate executive order that would bring in expansion of federal regulation on energy, arguing that it goes beyond the president's authority. The order, signed by Biden on his first day in office, set up a working group to investigate the social cost of emissions. It came back and said that such social costs came to $9.5 trillion per year. The states filing suit seem unconvinced that this is a robust figure, and they argue that proposed regulation as a result would inflict billions or trillions of dollars of damage to the economy for decades to come. Practically, decarbonising the grid will be challenging and expensive enough. It's based on real outcomes, trade-offs and concerns that you make sure you do it in a way that keeps the energy supply reliable, the cost of energy to consumers affordable. Is that project safe in the hands of people who are focused on the social cost of emissions, which seems motivated by a different agenda entirely? Now maybe, I don't rule it out, but I start sceptical. Still, at least with all this action on climate change, Joe Biden will be able to count on Greta Thunberg as a fan. Except, of course, that the Swedish teenager gets her kicks from disabusing powerful people of any notion that they have her support. She did it for the European Commission last year, and she did it again this week on MSNBC, saying that Biden wasn't doing nearly enough with his climate policies. She didn't specifically say any policy she thought he should be implementing, but she wanted Biden to treat it like a crisis, which is a bit mean. But, you know, he'll probably forget all about it by tomorrow. In other news, the UK government has finally caved to pressure, a phrase I seem to be saying a lot these days, and ordered a public inquiry into the proposed Cumbria coal mine that had climate scientist James Hansen threatening the Prime Minister with humiliation, saying that going ahead with the mine would send a terrible message ahead of the COP26 meeting. Various Green groups have also been warning the UK not to support the proposed appointment of former Australian Finance Minister Matthias Cormann to become the head of the OECD. They feel that his track record on climate change isn't strong enough, and that supporting him would send a terrible message ahead of the COP26 meeting. You can probably just append that last argument to every dispute on climate issues for the next 6 months. Wearing his climate activist hat rather than his scientist hat, Michael Mann sought to apply similar pressure to the Biden team, which is reportedly likely to support Cormann. Cormann has protested that he supports global climate coordination, but Mann has branded him nevertheless as an inactivist, whose track record in government means that he shouldn't be trusted with such a pivotal position. The messages do seem to be bordering on an insistence of ideological purity, which is something that has implications above and beyond this single position. Now, in a minute, we'll reply to comments and go to the final thought for the week. But first, this week the Chinese government outlined its next 5-year plan at its annual 2-sessions gathering in Beijing. Some people were disappointed that they felt it didn't focus in a detailed way on the country's stated intent to peak its greenhouse gas emissions in 2030, leading to net zero by 2060. Others have argued that there's more detail to come, and what's there already is an indicator that things are in motion. What's the evidence whether or not China is actually serious about climate change? It's notably guarded about its real intentions, highly strategic about how it takes action on the global stage. So what's the story? Well, I'll be talking about that in the video due to go live on this channel at 7 PM UK time on Wednesday next week. If you want to understand more about the emerging superpower of our era and how its actions may affect all of us, then join me then. I had a comment on the acid rain video referencing my statement at the end when I said this, but when it comes to how we get public policy informed by but not a slave to the science, I think we've still got some way to go. I hope that by that you did not mean to say that it is okay to base government policies on whatever evidence that fits our preferences, preconceptions, or on whatever is preconceived as more popular, lucrative or convenient. An example from living memory that comes to mind of the consequences of such arbitrary handling of facts was the embarrassing lack of evidence of WMDs in Iraq. Well, no, that's not what I meant. I mean, it's a good description of current practice, but that's part of the problem, and people use the phrase guided by the science as a cover for doing exactly that. The science tells you the current understanding of the facts, and it may inform you of the current state of informed debate around the facts, where there's some doubt or dispute, which, is kind of often. You should base your policy on a correct view of reality, not a false one, but the science doesn't tell you what your policy should be. So to give you a COVID example, at what level of monthly deaths should you open up your society and release all restrictions? Now that's judgment call. You might say the answer's 0 because any deaths are too much. The implication of that is then your society stays locked up forever, and it's inconsistent then because you do tolerate a certain number of deaths from other causes as part of the background inevitability of life and death. So why those and not these? Science isn't going to answer that question for you. It might, an emphasis on the might, be able to present you with the likely consequences in terms of virus spread of certain policy actions. Sweden and the UK and Germany and America might all be informed by the same science, understand and accept it, and yet validly come to different judgments about when and how much to do as a result. People claiming to be led by the science as though it's all inevitable if you look at the data and there's no element of policymakers' choice in there, well, it's an effect to deflect blame. We need to be more mature than that, and in terms of what we expect from our political leaders. Luckily for me, I get held to account all the time, which keeps me on my toes. I had this comment after the obesity video. Good video, but early on you identify food and activity as being the key factors. You then only talk about the food aspect. As someone who's interested in active travel, I would have liked a bit more balance. Well, you're right, I could have said a bit more about that. In the Japan example I gave, it was certainly a factor there as well, since there was a lot more walking and cycling in Japan during its decades of peak slimness, shall we say. And that's perhaps also one of those factors that is changing there in Japan. It's certainly changing our own societies generally, but I think it's one of those areas where public policy has less leverage and less intrusiveness than it does when it comes to food. Government programmes to address obesity have been largely about food and food marketing measures, along with, some lame programmes to encourage people to exercise a bit more. The point is that people used to move a lot more by necessity. So far, the idea that you can encourage them to move for the mechanistic purpose of its impact on your body, that's only worked for a minority. And particularly because, you're not allowed to take the angle that would probably be the most influential. A couple of years ago, the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK banned an advert that encouraged weight loss products with an "Are you beach body ready?" tagline. Ironically, it attracted complaints because it promoted an unhealthy body image. It's not that impossibly idealistic images of beauty in advertising haven't been an issue. Absolutely they have been. Some of the companies promote ideals that no human being has ever matched up to ever because extensive Photoshop intervention was required. But that's not what the issue was here. It was, how dare you suggest I might be more sexually attractive if I lost some weight? Well, sometimes you have to put the work in. Life's a bitch like that. I had zero intention of talking about the high-profile Oprah interview that happened this week. I would be perfectly happy if the UK became a republic tomorrow, whilst acknowledging that the Queen is one of the most competent people in the UK. The organisation I used to work for, Business in a Community, had the Prince of Wales as its president. And one time Harry came to visit because his father wanted him to learn more about his charities. Now, all of my information on this is second-hand. BITC and I had an unspoken understanding I should be kept well away from the royal stuff. But the palace advised BITC that in order to keep the young prince's attention, it would be better if they could arrange to have a presentation given by younger female members of staff. And if they wore short skirts, all the better. To my disgust, that was arranged. I know he's grown up a bit since then, but as far as I'm concerned, it seems as though he's married the woman he deserves, and good luck to him. But, Piers Morgan, who has no time for Princess Meghan, left his job because he said that he didn't believe a word she'd said. Since some of the things she said about things we do know about were demonstrably untrue, whether deliberately or not, it's not out of the bounds of fair comment to speculate about the things we don't know, which is why it's notable that two of them, although they are completely unverifiable, are treated as unquestionable, which is why Morgan had to go. One, that somebody said something that could be interpreted as racist about the potential colour of the baby's skin, and two, that she had moments where she felt suicidal. You might argue that if you want the luxury of saying things that no decent person may challenge, you don't say them to Oprah Winfrey in front of tens of millions of people. This wasn't a private conversation with her therapist. It was not only in front of tens of millions of people, but it was a highly public attack on people that are not allowed to answer back. An attack on an institution that matters and that people care about. The race comments were attributed to an unknown royal, putting all of them at suspicion. Their intent wasn't apparently clear, but it was held not to be important. Now, a number of Commonwealth countries have been discussing whether it's time to end their association with the Crown. Australia is suddenly debating whether they should remove the Queen as the head of state. I wouldn't blame any of them. As I said, I'd be a Republican tomorrow, happy as anything. I can't conceive of why Canada or Australia decides to have the Queen as their head of state. But change it for that reason? We saw this week how fragile any institution now is in the face of certain assumptions that come with the woke moment that we're living through. And the most invidious of these is that an unverifiable accusation of a vague and unspecified nature, if it uses the race element, is enough, in the absence of any due process, to cause apparently intelligent people in authority to consider sufficient to take major political actions. Indeed, on the US chat show The Talk, Piers Morgan was labelled as racist for having the temerity to suggest he didn't believe Meghan. Sharon Osbourne, who defended him, was then put through the usual mangle until she came out apologising and begging forgiveness. Piers Morgan is often wrong, and he's a bully with guests on his show. I find him intensely disagreeable. But he's allowed to say that he disagrees with someone without it being assumed that it's a racist act. It seems to me that no institution can survive in such an environment. Facts matter. Context matters. Intent matters. Feelings, whoever may be feeling them, are either secondary to such things or we are into the next dark ages. Hopefully we're not there yet. It feels as though we're moving closer all the time, with people being banned from social media, cartoon characters being cancelled, videos demonetised. Luckily, thanks to the support of some good people via Patreon, that last one I don't have to worry about too much. I don't have to worry about which topics will be considered out of bound for YouTube advertisers. I can just talk about the subjects I think are important, I think you'll want to know about, and I can say what I really think about them. I couldn't do that, certainly, without those patrons, and certainly not to the rate of 3 videos per week. If you would like to add your support to the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce on this channel, please head over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.